This is a great honor to be here in the 6th Anti-Apartheid Week in Toronto, which is the place where Anti-Apartheid Week was born. And I'm going to speak a little about the work that I'm involved with from a Jewish anti-Zionist perspective in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. For some, it is natural to organize in support of Palestinians as Jews. For others, it isn't. I'm in the later group. For a long time, I resisted it, and many that I know did the same. We saw it as a distraction from the main issue, which is what is happening to Palestinians. And I think we come to the understanding that it is a necessary distraction for us. Speaking as Jews allows us to enlarge the space to which the reality of Palestinian history as victims of Zionism has access. That is also a problem. To speak as a Jew in support of the Palestinian struggle is to exercise a privilege that is the product of a racist discourse. It is a rather unique situation, if you think about it, when in the face of a mountain of evidence about the absolutely horrible oppression of Palestinians by a state that calls itself a Jewish state, Palestinians often have to produce Jewish support in order to be allowed to speak and to be heard. Now, we have to give that support when it is asked, but how to give that support and how to exercise that privilege in a way that doesn't also at the same time act against Palestinians, substituting for them and reproducing the privilege itself is not a simple matter, and I don't have simple solutions. But I'll start by saying something that shouldn't be needed to be said. The truth and justice of the Palestinian liberation struggle is not measured by the amount of Jewish support it attracts. That should be something that we should remember. It is also important to hold to that original reticence and not to forget that however we find it useful to speak as Jews, it must be done in a way that is actively conscious of the centrality of Palestinian liberation. As anti-Zionist Jews, we have our own reasons to want to escape the current situation in which we find ourselves. These reasons are valid, and we need to not be cagey about them. And I hope to touch on some of them tonight. There is a long and deep tradition of principled Jewish opposition to Zionism. And we need to keep the faith of that tradition. But that tradition was born under conditions of Jewish powerlessness and exclusion. In most places, not in all places, but in most places, this is no longer the case today. We therefore have to translate that tradition to our current conditions. The opposition to Zionist racism must begin by the conscious abolition of the racist order in our own practice, and therefore it must begin with the privilege of the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian experience of oppression. It is useful to keep in mind a simple truth. A group of European Jews, in the name of the Jewish people, took over Palestine, expelled Palestinians, built their power, wealth, and identity on the basis of that oppression. Now, I'm intentionally saying here Jews and not Israelis, although the two are not the same. There is no easy way to define the difference between them. It is a messy demarcation, and any way you cut it, there are risks. We cannot accept the Zionist claim that Israel is the state of the Jews de jure. It is not. Most Jews are unaffiliated with Israel, and many Jews are horrified by Israel. But neither can we ignore the de facto success of Zionism in establishing hegemony within most Jewish communal institutions in the West today. It is this hegemony that lends the adjective Jewish its power, and we must hold to the awareness of its indelible history and its effect on us, on our locations as agents, even when we share a vision of equality and justice. Only the actual dismantling of apartheid will open up the future for overcoming these effects. Finally, we shouldn't exaggerate the power of the pure voice, even the Jewish voice. Racism is not ignorance. It is not a misconception of reality. And it cannot be overcome by talking to it. Racism is a structure of domination, and the purpose of Jewish organizing in support of Palestinian liberation is therefore not merely a matter of having Jews speak out as Jews in defense of Palestinian rights, but that speaking out, which is a necessary tactic, must be done and fought out in a strategic way as part of an assault on these structures of domination. And that assault must be led by the victims of racism today. This brings us to Apartheid Week. Apartheid, for both legal, practical, and historical reasons, is a key term of Palestinian strategy, including BDS. It is an absolutely fantastic and inspiring to see the growing public understanding that the Israeli regime is a regime of apartheid, and it is. It was also inspiring to see the growing support of BDS, including among Jewish and Israeli groups. We have now boycott from within, quite recently, an Israeli group in support of boycott. I think this is a very important development. And I think it's a special place to put a standing ovation to you here as the activists of Toronto, who played such an important role in driving this movement forward and in showing us how it's done. So thank you. Speaking, however, under the Jewish name imposes additional tasks, and in particular, the task of challenging the hegemonic incorporation of this adjective, the forms of discourse and the political structures that infuses it with privilege. The state of Israel oppresses Palestinians, that is clear, but it doesn't do it alone. Far from it. It enjoys massive international support, and this international support, to be clear, is a matter of neither magnanimity towards Jews nor Jewish power per se. But the adjective Jewish, as well as many actual Jews, play key roles in enabling and articulating this support. And we see this support already in the amount of backlash, but this event itself is generating. So I want to focus on a key discourse in which the adjective Jewish is functioning in enabling apartheid in Israel. And this is, of course, we're talking about anti-Semitism and about the way Jewish history is mobilized in support for apartheid. But much more than apartheid, and that's something that is going to be key. Now, we're here in Canada, and I want to stress that, a country that, when it really mattered, did not stand against anti-Semitism. The Canadian government at the time worked hard to avoid taking any Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. But I'm not going to talk about how horrible this history was. The Holocaust was one of the most horrible chapters in history, and anti-Semitism one of the ugliest manifestations in a very long list of European depravities. I take all that for granted. I want to talk about the history of anti-Semitism and Jewish history at its center as it is mobilized, and how the same states, like Canada, who colluded with Nazi anti-Semitism at the time, are now brandishing their newfound love of Jews to defend their continuing racism. Now, this history is even mobilized directly against BDS. The French Interior Minister recently condemned BDS as a campaign against kosher food. Now, yes, that's funny, because, of course, we don't have such a boycott. It should be clear. There's no boycott of kosher food. BDS campaign is specific about not even targeting individual Israelis, let alone Jews or Jewish practices. This is absolute lie, and the fact that they lie so brazenly, I think there's a silver lining here, because there's a sense of desperation in that level of lying. So we should be proud of that. Another common talking point is to liken BDS to the Nazi call to boycott Jewish shops in 1933. And that's a perfect example of the selective use of Jewish history, because at the same time there was a boycott of German goods called by the American Association of Jewish War Veterans. And that boycott, of course, is not compared to BDS. And in fact, it's not even remembered. Nobody, pretty much, it's a secret. It's been erased from history, and one reason it was erased from history is because the Zionist leadership at the time not only rejected that boycott, but helped the German Reich undermine it. The Ha'avara Agreement in 1933, signed between the Zionist leadership and the German Reich, made Palestine a privileged destination for German goods at the very moment when Jewish activists in the US and other countries were trying to mount an international global grassroots movement against Nazism. So that's one reason why we don't remember that. And I want to claim that boycott also, because this is part of the history that should inform Jews when they reject apartheid in Palestine, about the deep historical roots of Jewish opposition to Zionism. The Jewish case against Zionism is not from today, and it is rooted in the rejection of Zionism as a reactionary ideology in toto. Zionism contempt for the Palestinian people residing in Palestine was the direct and natural extension of its general reactionary outlook, an outlook of contempt for the oppressed wherever they are, including the Jews of Europe, and a general willingness to serve oppression. This is a painful history, and I do understand the conditions that led some Jews in those terrifying times to adopt those reactionary attitudes. And I can feel their loneliness and their despair at the time, but they were wrong. And the history of Jewish opposition to Zionism is part of the proof that they were wrong, that it was possible to think otherwise. I do take issues with the way the history of these terrible choices is appropriated sometimes in a white Christian context within a discourse that is apologetic of white supremacy. And I want to stress that criticizing these choices that were made then can only be done within a commitment to the struggle against all racism. One second. Pardon? No, that's okay. Just a moment. Now, of course, that's kind of talking about these events that informs my problem with Zionism is already putting me in the hot seat, because there is a now wave of attempts to institutionalize a new definition of anti-Semitism that specifically targets any structural and radical criticism of Zionism and of the State of Israel. It started with the EUMC 2005 EU Declaration, which cites a variety of criticism of Zionism as anti-Semitic. It continues in the UK with a parliamentary group about anti-Semitism founded in 2006 that defines whatever Zionist institutions call anti-Semitism as anti-Semitism. It continues with kind of in 2009 there was a global meeting in London, and out of that we have now a parliamentary inquiry about anti-Semitism, which seeks to do the same thing in Canada. In France, a woman called Sakina Arnaud, an activist, a French activist, is standing trial today for putting a boycott sticker on an OJ bottle in a French supermarket, and she's accused of inciting racial and national hatred. So there's a concerted effort to define BDS, to define any serious and effective criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism. One of the things that I've done as part of my work with the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network